The first time it happened, I told myself it was an accident. I was standing at my kitchen window early one morning, watching fresh snow fall in thick, heavy flakes. The streetlights cast that soft orange glow that makes everything look peaceful, almost fake. The kind of morning where the world feels quiet enough to breathe. Then I heard the plow. The sound came low and steady, metal scraping asphalt, getting closer. I watched it clear the road cleanly in front of my house. The driver slowed down right at the corner. For a second, I thought he was being careful. Then the blade lifted. A massive wave of snow rolled off the plow and slammed straight onto my front yard. Not near it, not close to it, directly onto it. I stood there frozen, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the pile grow taller by the second. When the plow moved on, it left behind a dirty, compacted mound stretching across half my property. I sighed and shrugged it off. Snow had to go somewhere, right? Maybe next time they'd push it somewhere else. That was my first mistake. The second storm came 3 days later. Same routine. Same plow. Same corner. This time, the snow pile doubled in size. Packed hard, gray with road salt, already starting to freeze solid. By the third storm, I knew it wasn't an accident. Every other house on the street had clean edges. Snow pushed neatly into designated areas. My yard, on the other hand, looked like the neighborhood landfill. I live in a community run by an HOA. The kind that sends reminder emails about trash cans being visible for more than 12 hours. The kind that measures grass height. The kind that never misses a chance to remind you who's in charge. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I emailed them. I kept it polite. Friendly, even. I explained that the snowplow was dumping snow onto my property and asked if they could redirect it. No response. A week later, another storm hit. By then, the pile was tall enough to block part of my driveway. I couldn't see traffic clearly when pulling out. The sidewalk disappeared under ice and slush. I emailed again. This time, I attached photos. Still nothing. I tried calling. Left a voicemail. Waited. Nothing. That's when irritation started turning into something heavier. Not anger yet. More like realization. The slow understanding that this wasn't being ignored by accident. They had chosen my property. Corner lot. Fewer complaints. Easier dumping ground. And they assumed I'd just deal with it. By December, winter had fully settled in. Storm after storm rolled through, and every single one added another layer. Snow, ice, frozen slush, chunks of gravel. The pile hardened into something dense and immovable. Shoveling was useless. The snow was compacted by heavy equipment. My shovel bounced off it like concrete. One morning, I woke up to find a warning notice on my car. Apparently, parking on the street overnight was a violation. I stared at it in disbelief. My driveway was blocked by a pile of snow they had dumped there, and now I was being punished for adapting. That was the moment something snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly. I started documenting everything. Dates. Times. Photos. Videos. Every pass of the plow. Every new layer added. I stopped asking them to fix it. I just watched. And the pile kept growing. By January, it was taller than my fence. Neighbors started slowing down when they passed my house. Some stared. Some shook their heads. A few asked what was going on. When I explained, most of them were surprised. A few laughed nervously, like it wasn't their problem yet. The HOA finally replied to one of my emails. The message was short and cold. They said snow placement fell under standard winter operations, and that residents were responsible for managing snow on their own property. I read it twice. Then a third time. That email changed everything. Because in trying to brush me off, they accidentally confirmed something important. That snow was now considered my responsibility. And if it was my responsibility, then it was also my property. That thought stayed with me. I started looking at the pile differently. Not as a problem, but as material. Something solid. Something heavy. Something that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. One evening, after another storm, I stood outside in the cold, staring at it. The streetlight cast long shadows across the uneven surface. It was no longer just a pile. It was a mass. A barrier. And as cars slowed down at the corner, struggling to see around it, a strange idea began forming in my mind. If the HOA wanted to use my land as a dumping ground all winter, what if I stopped fighting it? What if I let it become exactly what they were creating? That was the night I stopped complaining. And started planning. After that night, I stopped seeing the snow pile as something temporary. It wasn't going to melt anytime soon. The temperatures stayed below freezing, and every new storm made it harder, denser, and heavier. The HOA had turned my front yard into a long-term storage site, whether they admitted it or not. Instead of shoveling, I started observing. I noticed how the plow approached the corner. It slowed down slightly, lifted the blade at just the right angle, and released the snow like clockwork. The driver didn't even look toward my house anymore. This wasn't a mistake. It was routine. That realization hurt more than the snow itself. I measured the pile one afternoon, mostly out of curiosity. At its highest point, it was over 7 feet tall. The base stretched nearly 10 feet wide. It had layers like sediment, each storm compressed on top of the last. You could tell where early snow had turned to ice, where salt had eaten through, where tires had pushed debris into it. This thing wasn't going anywhere. The HOA sent another email that week. Not about the snow. About my lawn ornaments, which were apparently seasonally inappropriate. I stared at the screen, half amused, half angry. They could monitor decorative items, but not a mountain of ice blocking my driveway. That's when I stopped responding entirely. Silence can be unsettling. When people expect you to complain and you don't, they don't know how to react. I could feel it shifting. The dumping continued, but slower. Hesitant. The next storm came with heavy wind. Snow drifted sideways, piling even higher against the existing mound. I didn't touch it. I let gravity do the work. At night, temperatures dropped hard, freezing everything solid. By the end of that week, the pile had become something else. The edges were sharp. The surface was smooth and reflective. It stood taller than the hood of most cars passing by. Drivers started braking at the corner. Some rolled their windows down to look. One delivery truck had to back up and try a different angle. That's when the first neighbor knocked on my door. He was polite but concerned. Said the pile was becoming dangerous. Said visibility was bad. I agreed with him. Then I told him exactly how the snow got there. I showed him the emails. He didn't know any of that. Neither did most of the neighborhood. Word spread faster than I expected. People started connecting dots. Complaints shifted direction. The HOA's office phone rang more often. A few days later, 2 board members showed up at my house without warning. They stood on the sidewalk, looking uncomfortable, like they'd rehearsed this conversation but didn't like their lines. They said the snow pile was getting out of hand. I said it wasn't my doing. They told me I needed to remove it. I asked who would pay for it. They didn't answer. Instead, they warned me about fines. That was the moment I decided to lean in. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Just deliberately. That night, I went outside with a hose. I sprayed water along the base of the pile, letting it seep in and freeze. I smoothed one side, shaping it slightly. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to guide where the next snowfall would settle. I wasn't building anything new. I was letting their actions finish the job. Another storm hit 2 days later. When the plow dumped more snow, it stacked upward instead of spreading outward. The pile grew taller, thicker, and more vertical. It looked like a wall now. Not touching the road. Not crossing any lines. But impossible to ignore. The HOA sent a formal notice the next morning. Claimed I was creating a hazard. Threatened daily fines. Demanded immediate action. I read it calmly and filed it with the rest of my documentation. Then I did nothing. Traffic slowed more every day. During rush hour, cars lined up at the corner. People honked. Some got out and waved their arms, frustrated. I stood on my porch one morning, watching it all unfold, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Relief. For the first time, the inconvenience was visible to everyone, not just me. Police drove by once. Slowed. Looked. Kept going. The HOA panicked. They emailed again, demanding removal within 24 hours. This time, they CC'd their attorney. That told me everything I needed to know. They were losing control. I finally replied. One sentence. I will remove the snow when the HOA compensates me for unauthorized dumping on my property. That email ended the pretending. The plow came again that night. And despite everything, it dumped snow on my property. Higher. Heavier. Defiant. By morning, the wall was massive. Tall enough that drivers couldn't see around it at all. Cars had to stop completely before turning. A school bus rerouted. A delivery truck got stuck. That's when the police returned. This time, they knocked. I opened the door calmly, documents already in hand. I explained everything. The officer listened. He walked to the wall. Tapped it with his boot. It's solid, he said. Then he looked at me and said, "You didn't put this here, did you?" I shook my head. He nodded slowly. And that's when the HOA realized something terrifying. They had pushed a problem onto someone who had stopped carrying it. And now, it was standing right in the middle of their street. By the time the third week of January rolled around, the wall had taken on a life of its own. What started as a pile of snow had become something monumental, a silent testament to months of neglect and abuse. Neighbors whispered as they drove by, some shaking their heads, others snapping photos. A few even stopped to ask questions. I answered only when necessary, keeping my tone calm. There was no point in shouting. The truth was obvious, and the wall spoke louder than I ever could. The HOA escalated quickly. They sent letters via certified mail, threatening fines, citations, and even potential legal action. Their language was formal, cold, filled with words like nuisance, immediate removal, and obstruction of public right-of-way. They made it sound urgent, as if I had erected the wall on purpose to harm the community. But I knew better. I had done nothing but let them continue what they had already started. I wasn't creating a problem, I was holding them accountable. When their attorney's letter arrived, the tone shifted. It was sharper, almost aggressive. They accused me of intentional obstruction and claimed public safety was at risk. I read the letter twice. Then I forwarded it to the attorney I had already retained in case this escalated. My lawyer was calm, almost amused, which made me feel strangely reassured. "They're panicking," he said. "Let them file. They won't like the discovery phase." The discovery phase. That sounded ominous, but I understood the logic. Every email I had sent, every photo I had taken, every ignored complaint, they all became evidence. I realized the wall wasn't just a pile of snow anymore, it was leverage. Every inch of ice and slush was proof that the HOA had repeatedly dumped on my property despite formal complaints. And suddenly, the power dynamic had shifted. Word spread quickly. The story went beyond my street. Social media pages shared pictures of the towering snow wall. Drone footage captured its size and density. People from nearby neighborhoods came just to see it. Comments poured in. Most were supportive, saying things like, "Finally, someone stands up to these HOA bullies," or "I'd do the same if they kept dumping on my property." Some laughed nervously, others marveled at how a simple pile of snow had become so symbolic. Inside the HOA, chaos reigned. Board members argued at meetings. The plow company was called in and questioned repeatedly. The president tried to shift blame, but no one could deny the emails, photos, and timestamps. They had created this situation themselves and had no one to blame but their policies and decisions. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew the pile was my doing in their minds, even though I hadn't added a single flake intentionally. The first attempt to remove the wall was disastrous. A small crew arrived with shovels and a snow blower. They underestimated the density. Hours passed. One machine broke under the pressure. Workers stepped back, exhausted, muttering about how frozen it had become. I stood at the porch, watching quietly. They were finally seeing what I had endured all winter, the sheer effort required to remove something that wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. News of the failed removal attempt reached the local news station. Within a day, a reporter showed up with a camera crew. Interviews were conducted with neighbors, most of whom were supportive, some neutral, a few complaining about the inconvenience. When I spoke, I was calm, measured. I explained that the snow had been repeatedly dumped on my property, that I had documented everything, and that the wall was a result of neglect, not malice. The footage aired that evening. Overnight, the wall became a symbol, not just of snow, but of resistance and accountability. The HOA filed a lawsuit. They wanted an injunction demanding immediate removal and compensation for what they claimed were public hazards. I was ready. My attorney presented the timeline of complaints, photographs showing the snow accumulation over time, and copies of all correspondence. Every email they ignored, every storm they dumped snow, every warning they sent after the fact, it all painted a clear picture. By the end of the first hearing, the judge leaned back, rubbed his temples, and looked directly at the HOA attorneys. He didn't need to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered to watch. Some waved at me. Others shook their heads, incredulous at how the situation had escalated. The local news was there again, capturing reactions. It felt surreal. The same pile of snow that had blocked my driveway and forced me to dodge fines was now something people admired, a physical testament to standing firm. The legal process dragged on for weeks. The HOA tried to argue necessity, claiming snow had nowhere else to go. But that argument fell flat when the timestamps showed they had options. They had chosen my property. They had ignored repeated complaints. Every attempt to justify themselves weakened their case. The judge's patience, already thin, grew thinner. Finally, he denied the injunction, stating clearly that private property rights cannot be overridden by convenience. The ruling was precise, concise, and decisive. With the legal victory in hand, I still didn't demolish the wall immediately. My attorney advised against it, explaining that premature removal could weaken any future claims for damages or costs if they tried to retaliate. So I let it sit, a silent, frozen monument in the middle of winter. The plow crews adjusted routes, avoiding my property entirely. The streets slowly returned to functionality, but the wall remained. Drivers slowed, honked, and sometimes stopped entirely to take pictures. Some neighbors called it the Winter Monument. Others whispered about the snow barricade. Even when the physical wall finally melted, its shadow remained in the neighborhood's consciousness. The HOA was shaken. Board members resigned quietly over the months that followed. Policies were rewritten. Snow removal procedures clarified. Private property lines were respected in a way they hadn't been before. My yard, now repaired, looked almost normal, but the lesson lingered. The wall had done more than block a street, it had blocked complacency and forced recognition. Looking back, I realized the winter had changed me as well. I learned that boundaries matter more than politeness. That silence and inaction can be exploited. That standing firm doesn't require aggression, only consistency. The snow wall wasn't about revenge or spectacle, it was about reclaiming control over what was mine. And in doing so, I had inadvertently become a lesson for the entire community. By the time spring arrived, people drove past that corner differently. They slowed down, aware, cautious, perhaps remembering the winter when one homeowner refused to be ignored. I didn't gloat. I didn't brag. I simply knew that sometimes, the most effective action is patience paired with documentation and firm boundaries. That wall, frozen in the middle of winter, was more than ice. It was evidence, leverage, and a story that would be told long after the snow had melted. And in that story, I discovered something even more important than winning against an HOA. I discovered the power of refusing to carry someone else's burden, no matter how normalized it had become. Winter dragged on, relentless and heavy, but the wall had taken on a permanence that nothing, not even the coldest nights, could erase. The snow, once soft and fluffy, had hardened into a dense, compacted mass. Each layer told a story of storms ignored, of plows that wouldn't steer clear, of my complaints that vanished into the void. But more than that, it told a story about boundaries, about what happens when you refuse to be the default dumping ground for someone else's mistakes. The neighborhood had changed around it. People stopped casually parking near my driveway. Cars slowed as they passed, some rolling down their windows to take pictures or wave. Children, curious and fearless, peered at the wall, trying to estimate its height. I caught myself smiling at the odd sense of pride that stirred within me. I hadn't built it, the HOA had. But by refusing to remove it, I had transformed their negligence into something monumental. Then came the emails. They never stopped. Formal letters, threatening letters, calls from attorneys, all demanding the wall's removal. At first, I read them with irritation, letting them fester unopened for days. Later, I started to find them almost entertaining. Their panic was palpable. The board members no longer sent representatives to talk in person, now they sent written threats. I kept each one carefully, organized by date and storm. Every message added weight to my case, a record of their own choices. The first confrontation in person after that was surreal. A small group of HOA representatives arrived, trying to appear calm. They spoke quickly, almost nervously, demanding immediate action. They pointed at the wall as if I had personally dumped each flake of snow. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, measured, calm. I listened without interrupting. They finished their statements, then looked at me for a response. I said nothing. Silence is powerful. It forces others to confront themselves, to consider that maybe the problem isn't the one they are accusing. Traffic had become an unexpected ally. Drivers slowed, cautious of the massive obstruction. Delivery trucks rerouted. Some residents had to wait at the corner for minutes, watching the wall in disbelief. And yet, no one complained publicly beyond the HOA. They understood, instinctively, that this wasn't a simple pile of snow anymore, it was a statement. It demanded attention. It demanded consideration. Local news caught wind of the story. A reporter arrived with a camera crew one cold morning, capturing the frozen mass in the weak winter sunlight. I explained the situation calmly, reciting the timeline and emphasizing the repeated attempts to resolve the issue. It wasn't just about snow, I said, it was about responsibility and accountability. When you ignore someone long enough, eventually the problem becomes visible to everyone. The footage aired that evening, and suddenly my quiet street became a symbol of resistance. Comments flooded social media. Most supported me, some were amused, a few skeptical. But all were captivated. The HOA's reaction escalated to legal threats. Their attorney drafted injunctions and filed complaints, claiming that the wall obstructed public pathways and posed safety hazards. I wasn't intimidated. My attorney was meticulous, armed with documentation and evidence. Every ignored email, every photograph showing the snow's gradual accumulation, every instance of the plow dumping onto my property, everything was organized into a clear, undeniable narrative. What the HOA didn't expect was that the longer they delayed action, the more evidence stacked against them. Neighbors started approaching me, quietly at first, then with growing confidence. Some admitted they had suffered quietly under the HOA's arbitrary rules for years. Fines for minor infractions, warnings for negligible offenses, demands that seemed impossible to meet. They confessed that watching the snow wall gave them courage, that it reminded them they weren't powerless. I hadn't realized my passive resistance could inspire others, but it had. The wall wasn't just a barrier, it had become a lesson. The first attempt to remove the wall, led by a small private crew hired by the HOA, was a disaster. They underestimated the density. Shovels bounced off like rubber. Snow blowers jammed under the sheer weight of ice. Hours passed, frustration mounting, workers leaving exhausted and muttering under their breath. I stood on my porch, silently observing. They were finally witnessing the result of repeated negligence firsthand. The physical effort required to undo months of careless dumping was more than anyone had anticipated. By mid-February, the story had grown beyond the neighborhood. Local news covered it repeatedly, highlighting the absurdity of the situation and the clear documentation showing the HOA's role. People outside the community shared the photos online, fascinated by the concept of a homeowner passively resisting authority in such a visual, dramatic way. The snow wall became a symbol, not only of winter but of asserting boundaries, standing firm, and refusing to absorb what wasn't yours. Then came the legal proceedings. The HOA pushed for emergency injunctions, but the judge, after reviewing the meticulous records, denied the request. Private property rights cannot be overridden by administrative convenience, he said. It was the first real victory. Not a dramatic moment with fanfare, but a quiet acknowledgement that the law recognized responsibility and boundaries. It validated months of patience, observation, and careful documentation. Even when the snow began to melt, the psychological impact remained. The HOA had been shaken to its core. Board members resigned quietly. Policies were rewritten, contracts clarified, and plow routes adjusted. Private property lines were respected for the first time in years. Neighbors spoke differently in meetings, asking questions, challenging vague policies, and insisting on clarity. The snow wall had done more than block a street, it had blocked complacency. I learned something profound from those weeks. Boundaries aren't always enforced by confrontation. Sometimes, silence and steadfastness are far more powerful. The wall wasn't aggressive. It didn't shout. It just existed, unmovable, a visual record of inaction and negligence. And sometimes, that is enough to force change. Even after the wall finally melted completely, drivers and neighbors still remembered. The corner became a point of quiet awareness. People slowed down, glanced at the lot, and reflected. What had been a nuisance had become a lesson etched in memory. The HOA, cautious and defensive, operated differently afterward. Their power had been challenged, and the community had witnessed it. That winter, that one pile of snow, had reshaped relationships, policies, and perspectives in ways no one had anticipated. By the time spring arrived, the yard looked normal again. Grass sprouted where ice had once hardened. The driveway was clear. But the memory of the wall, the lessons it represented, stayed with me. Standing firm doesn't always require confrontation or aggression. Sometimes it requires observation, patience, and allowing others' actions to speak for themselves. That winter, the snow wall taught me, and my community, a lesson in accountability and respect. It was never about revenge. It was about asserting what was rightfully mine and refusing to let others' negligence dictate my life. And in doing so, I discovered that the quietest acts of resistance often have the loudest impact. After the legal victory, life returned to a strange kind of normal. The snow slowly began to melt, dripping down in thick slabs, revealing patches of brown grass and debris that had been trapped underneath for months. I spent hours cleaning and repairing my yard, but the physical work was secondary to the mental shift that had taken place. I wasn't the same homeowner who had watched the first plow dump snow onto my lawn in disbelief. Something had changed in me, the confidence, the patience, the understanding that some battles are won by standing still rather than by moving aggressively. The neighborhood, however, didn't return to normal so quickly. People still stopped by the corner, asking questions, laughing nervously, or just shaking their heads at what had happened. The story had spread far beyond our small community. Social media posts were shared and reshared, accompanied by videos, drone footage, and even memes. Some people admired the passive resistance. Others called it petty revenge. But almost everyone admitted it was unforgettable. My quiet yard had become a symbol of defiance without a single word being shouted. The HOA, meanwhile, was in chaos. Board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons, but everyone knew it was connected to the snow wall debacle. Policies were rewritten almost overnight. Snow removal routes were carefully planned to avoid private property. Notifications were sent proactively, and emails that once went ignored were now answered promptly. The organization, which had once seemed untouchable, had been shaken to its core. It was a reminder that the consequences of neglect are rarely subtle, especially when someone refuses to absorb them. Some neighbors approached me privately, confessing that they had endured similar injustices for years but had remained silent. Fines for minor infractions. Unexplained warnings. Complaints ignored or brushed off. Watching the snow wall unfold had given them courage. Some even admitted that if they had been in my position, they might have acted differently, perhaps aggressively, but they understood why I had chosen patience and documentation instead. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And the neighborhood, for the first time, began to recognize the difference. Local news outlets continued covering the story. Interviews were conducted weeks after the initial events, focusing on how a single homeowner could, through patience and evidence, shift the balance of power. Commentators compared it to David and Goliath, not a battle fought with swords, but with steadfastness, observation, and documentation. The story resonated because it was relatable. Everyone had experienced being ignored or having their concerns minimized. The snow wall wasn't just a local spectacle, it was a metaphor. The wall itself had become almost a character in our winter narrative. Children measured it, estimating its height with childish awe. Drivers joked about it. Delivery drivers complained, but quietly, with a hint of admiration. Neighbors would mention it at community events, sometimes laughing, sometimes seriously reflecting on the lessons it taught. The snow had been temporary, but the cultural memory it left behind was permanent. It became shorthand for overreach, negligence, and the power of quiet resistance. The HOA, understandably, tried to spin the narrative in their favor. They sent letters claiming safety concerns and public obstruction. But their attempts fell flat because the public had already seen the evidence. Emails ignored, photographs captured, timelines documented, the narrative had already been written by months of accumulation. Every attempt to frame me as the problem backfired. Their own actions were on display for anyone willing to look. Financially, the HOA suffered minor setbacks. The failed snow removal efforts, legal fees, and policy overhauls were costly. The community, once complacent, began scrutinizing budgets, questioning allocations, and demanding transparency. It was as if the snow wall had triggered a long overdue awakening. What had started as a nuisance in my yard became a catalyst for accountability across the entire organization. I, on the other hand, found myself reflecting on what the experience had taught me personally. Boundaries are not always enforced through confrontation. Silence and consistency can be far more powerful than shouting. Documenting every incident, remaining calm, and letting actions speak for themselves had turned a frustrating situation into a story of empowerment. I realized that much of life's frustration comes from absorbing what doesn't belong to you. The HOA had assumed I would shoulder the burden of their neglect. When I refused, the consequences became visible. That's when change happened. Even after the wall melted, the lesson endured. Residents who had once felt powerless began speaking up. Meetings were more structured, questions were asked more frequently, and the culture of fear that the HOA had fostered over the years began to erode. The corner where the snow wall had stood became symbolic. People would nod toward it, subtly, when discussing new policies. It was a quiet reminder that authority is not absolute, and that accountability has a way of asserting itself, sometimes in ways no one expects. The spring that followed was unusually warm, and the snow wall slowly disappeared, leaving only the flattened, muddy imprint of what had once been. I restored my lawn, planted flowers, and repaired the driveway. But I didn't forget. Every time I looked at the corner, I saw more than dirt and grass. I saw months of patience, the power of evidence, and the weight of ignored responsibility. That memory shaped how I approached conflicts afterward. I no longer assumed compliance or goodwill. I documented. I observed. I waited for patterns before reacting. And when the time came, I responded decisively. By the next winter, the neighborhood's approach to snow removal had changed permanently. Plows avoided private property. Routes were mapped clearly. Residents were notified in advance. Even the board members who had once been careless now treated homeowners with a degree of respect and caution. The snow wall, while gone, had reshaped behavior. It had taught lessons about boundaries, patience, and the quiet enforcement of personal rights. I often think about that winter when I hear people dismissing small injustices as unavoidable. That's just the way it is, they say. I used to say it too. But the snow wall taught me that small injustices can accumulate until they become monumental. And when that happens, even passive resistance can force accountability. Sometimes, the most effective way to assert your boundaries is not to fight aggressively, but to let the consequences of others' actions become undeniable. The snow wall, in its frozen silence, had done more than block a driveway or a street. It had shifted perceptions, challenged authority, and inspired a community to pay attention. It reminded me, and everyone who witnessed it, that negligence is not invisible, and that responsibility, no matter how long delayed, has a way of asserting itself. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the snow, not the fines, not the emails. It was the lesson that standing firm, documenting reality, and letting consequences unfold naturally is often more powerful than shouting or confrontation. The wall melted, but the lesson remained, etched in memory and forever part of the neighborhood's winter lore. By the time February rolled into March, the snow wall had become legendary. It wasn't just a pile of frozen precipitation anymore, it was a spectacle. Every driver who passed that corner slowed, some to stare, some to laugh, some to shake their heads in disbelief. Even the local delivery companies started altering their routes to avoid the infamous obstacle. Social media pages for our neighborhood were buzzing with photos and commentary. People called it the barricade, the winter wall, even the HOA's frozen mistake. But for me, it wasn't a joke. It was months of patience, documentation, and standing firm distilled into something tangible. The HOA's panic had grown almost comical. Their emails became frantic, dripping with threats of fines and legal action. Every message I received was carefully catalogued, stamped with dates, times, and the weather conditions outside when the snow had been dumped. I wasn't just defending my property anymore, I was building an undeniable record. Each failed attempt they made to intimidate me only strengthened my position. Every ignored email, every empty threat, every plow dumping snow despite my complaints, it all became evidence that spoke louder than their words. Then the big escalation happened. A local news crew came back, cameras in tow, asking to film the wall from multiple angles. Drone footage captured its full scale, revealing just how massive and imposing it had become. I gave the same calm explanation as before, walking them through the timeline, emphasizing that the wall wasn't built out of malice, it was the result of repeated negligence and ignored complaints. Viewers were captivated. Comments flooded online. Most expressed support, some were amazed at my patience, and others were in disbelief that an HOA could be so careless. The wall was now a symbol of accountability. The HOA tried a final, desperate move. They hired a private snow removal crew, claiming it was a public safety hazard. I watched as the crew approached the wall with snow blowers and heavy equipment, clearly underestimating its density. Within minutes, the machines struggled against the compacted ice. Shovels bounced off. Snow blowers jammed and whined. The crew muttered under their breath, frustrated and exhausted. For the first time, they understood what I had endured all winter. What had seemed like a minor inconvenience now revealed itself as a monumental task, one that couldn't be undone easily. Then the lawyers got involved in person. The HOA president arrived with a team, their expressions a mix of anger and panic. They demanded I remove the wall immediately or face severe consequences. I calmly showed them the documentation, the emails, photos, and video clips. Each layer of snow, each time-stamped complaint, each ignored request, they were all part of the evidence. The president's face went pale as he realized that the narrative wasn't on their side. They had pushed the problem onto me, and now it had grown beyond anything they could control. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some cheered quietly. Others just watched, curious. A few approached the HOA team to ask what had been done about the wall in the first place, and the questions caught them off guard. The community, once passive, was now actively observing. The snow wall had become a lens through which people began questioning policies, accountability, and authority. I had never expected this ripple effect, but it was unmistakable. The local media covered the confrontation live. Drone shots, interviews, and time-lapse footage of the wall went viral. People shared it far beyond our neighborhood. Some called it a story of standing up to bureaucracy, others joked about the snow that stopped the HOA. But beneath the humor, there was a serious message: when negligence meets patience, even the most rigid authority can be challenged. The snow wall had become a symbol of resistance that didn't shout, it simply existed, immovable, undeniable, and powerful. The HOA tried one last legal maneuver. They filed for an emergency injunction, demanding immediate removal and claiming public obstruction. My attorney presented everything: the complete timeline of complaints, photographs showing snow accumulation over time, and every ignored email. The judge reviewed the documentation carefully. After a tense pause, he denied the injunction, stating clearly that private property rights could not be overridden for convenience or bureaucratic neglect. It was the final validation. The wall, created unwillingly by repeated negligence, had turned into proof of their own mistakes. After the hearing, the neighborhood dynamics shifted permanently. Board members resigned quietly over the following weeks. Policies were rewritten to prevent future misuse of private property. Snow removal routes were clarified. Residents were more vocal during meetings, asking precise questions, demanding explanations, and refusing to accept vague answers. The snow wall, though no longer physically growing, had reshaped the culture of the community. It was a frozen lesson in accountability, one that melted slowly but left permanent impressions. Even the drivers who had once complained about the obstruction began to nod in understanding when passing the corner. The wall had shown them what happens when responsibility is ignored and the consequences are left unchecked. They saw not just a pile of snow but months of patience, careful documentation, and quiet resistance. The story became almost mythical. Neighbors retold it during community events, using it as a cautionary tale about bureaucracy, negligence, and standing firm. For me, the experience left a lasting impression. I had learned the power of patience and evidence, the importance of boundaries, and the subtle strength of letting actions reveal themselves. I hadn't yelled, fought, or destroyed anything. I had done nothing but document, observe, and allow the consequences of neglect to become visible. And in doing so, I had shifted a neighborhood, reshaped an HOA, and created a story that would be told for years to come. When the snow finally melted completely, the yard looked normal again. Grass returned, debris was cleared, and the driveway was restored. But the impact of the wall lingered. Residents, neighbors, and even former board members remembered it. The lesson was clear: negligence has consequences, and patience paired with evidence can wield immense power. What had started as frustration over a single plow dumping snow had grown into a demonstration of accountability, respect, and the importance of standing firm. The corner where the wall had stood remained a symbol. People drove past more cautiously, aware that the homeowner had refused to be ignored. The HOA, now wary and careful, had permanently altered their procedures. The neighborhood, once passive and complacent, had awakened to the idea that authority is not absolute. And I realized that the snow wall's greatest legacy wasn't the inconvenience it caused, it was the lesson it left behind, a reminder that even the quietest acts of resistance can echo louder than any shouting. Spring finally arrived, and with it, the snow wall began to shrink in earnest. Drip by drip, slab by slab, the ice that had dominated my yard for months gave way to puddles and mud. The neighbors watched as it slowly disappeared, some silently reflecting, others joking about the absurdity of the winter. I didn't feel the need to celebrate. I had already won far more than just the legal battles. I had reclaimed something deeper: respect, boundaries, and the power of patience. The wall, once towering and imposing, had left an imprint that could never be erased, even if the last snowflake melted into the earth. The HOA, now fully chastened, quietly rewrote their policies. Snow removal procedures were clarified, routes were adjusted, and notices were promised in advance. But more importantly, the culture shifted. Meetings were no longer filled with fear or silent compliance. Neighbors began speaking up, asking questions, and holding the board accountable in ways they never had before. My simple act of patience, combined with documentation and restraint, had ignited a ripple effect far beyond my property line. The snow wall had taught lessons that laws, fines, or angry complaints could not. By mid-spring, my yard was restored. Green grass emerged from the brown patches, flowers began to bloom, and the driveway was clear and clean. The physical traces of the snow wall were gone, but the story remained. Neighbors stopped by to reminisce. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, others nodded in quiet respect. Children who had once measured the wall and marveled at its height now recounted the story as if it were a legend from another world. The time the snow blocked the street, they'd say, eyes wide. And indeed, it felt almost mythical, the way something so simple had grown so monumental. Even months later, strangers would occasionally stop by, having seen photos online or heard stories through the community grapevine. They wanted to know the details, how it happened, and how I handled it. I told them the same thing each time, that patience, documentation, and standing firm were more powerful than shouting or acting impulsively. That sometimes, letting consequences unfold naturally, while quietly observing and recording, can change more than anger ever could. It was a lesson I wished I had learned sooner, but one I would never forget. The HOA, humbled and cautious, now treated homeowners with far more respect. They could no longer assume that people would quietly absorb mistakes or negligence. Every decision was scrutinized, every route carefully planned, every complaint acknowledged. The organization, which once seemed untouchable, had been forced to recognize accountability and personal boundaries. My winter of frustration had transformed the culture of the community permanently. A single act of silent resistance had become a catalyst for lasting change. I often reflected on the experience quietly, sometimes while sitting on my porch during warm spring evenings. The snow wall had been a teacher in ways I hadn't anticipated. It taught me the importance of knowing when to act and when to observe, the power of evidence over emotion, and the subtle strength in refusing to be burdened by someone else's negligence. I realized that standing firm doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes, it's a quiet refusal, a persistent patience, and a willingness to let truth and consequences do the work for you. The lessons extended beyond my neighborhood. Friends, family, and even strangers who heard the story would ask for advice when dealing with bureaucracy, authority, or neglect. I shared the story not as a boast, but as an example of measured persistence. Document everything. Watch patterns. Respond calmly. Let consequences unfold. They were practical steps, and yet, when applied thoughtfully, they carried immense power. The snow wall was more than frozen precipitation, it was a blueprint for reclaiming agency in a world that often ignores it. By the time summer arrived, the corner where the wall had stood looked ordinary again. Drivers passed without slowing, deliveries resumed normally, and the yard appeared peaceful. But the memory lingered, both for me and for the community. It was a silent reminder of what had happened, that patience can be as disruptive as aggression when wielded with clarity and evidence. That negligence, when left unchecked, eventually becomes visible. That boundaries, once respected, create lasting order. The snow wall had melted, but its impact remained etched in memory, a winter story no one could ignore. I often tell the story to myself, quietly, when thinking about life's frustrations. It's a reminder that injustice doesn't always need confrontation to be addressed. Sometimes, it simply requires patience, documentation, and faith that the consequences of others' actions will reveal themselves. The wall wasn't built for revenge. It wasn't a spectacle created for attention. It existed because the HOA's negligence demanded that it exist, and by refusing to remove it, I let the truth speak for itself. In doing so, I discovered the most powerful lesson: standing firm without aggression can change more than yelling ever could. In the end, I didn't just win against the HOA. I won respect, boundaries, and a deep understanding of how to handle injustice with strategy rather than anger. The neighborhood learned, the HOA learned, and I learned that sometimes, the quietest acts leave the loudest impressions. The snow wall had been a frozen inconvenience, a stubborn visual statement, and a teacher all in one. It had transformed winter, my yard, and the community forever. And even after the ice melted, the story remained, a legend of patience, accountability, and quiet resilience. So, when the next winter rolls around, and snow begins to fall again, I'll remember that season, the one where a pile of snow refused to leave, and in doing so, taught a community to respect boundaries, responsibility, and patience. That wall may be gone physically, but its lessons are permanent, etched in memory like ice on a frozen driveway, unyielding, undeniable, and impossible to ignore.